Chapter 20, The Great War, World War I, 1914 to 1918. This chapter examines what had been to that time the largest war in modern history. In looking at this war, we want to be sure to consider what led to the decision for war for the United States, fighting the war, and last, third, making the peace. So let's look first at the decision for war. A little background on how the war began and why the war began in Europe. In looking at the origins of the conflict, it's important to understand that for years, building up to the beginning of the war in Europe in 1914, Old Europe and New Europe had been involved in competing imperial ambitions. In other words, competing empires for gaining more colonies, more wealth internationally. All of the status quo, the balance of power that had existed for decades, was upset just prior to the turn of the 20th century by the rise of Germany, in essence the new kid on the block. The rise of Germany caused Europe to divide into two basic camps, both diplomatically and militarily. In other words, into two blocks, two camps. These two sides or two blocks would eventually break down in war into the Allied powers versus the Central powers. And these sides or blocks would be ignited into conflict with the single event, the killing of the Austrian Archduke, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand. And you see his photo here on the screen. It is his assassination in 1914 that would touch off this massive world war. Now, when this war begins in Europe in 1914, the United States, far away from the conflict across the Atlantic Ocean, will declare neutrality. This had been our historic position. We were not yet a world power and certainly wanted to remain outside the conflict as long as possible. So President Wilson, who is president at this time, declares neutrality, and this decision is backed by the great majority of the American public. However, from the beginning of the conflict, there's clearly broad sympathy for the Allies for a number of reasons. The Allies, major Allies, consist of course, Great Britain, the mother country, France, who aided us in of course, the American Revolution, and ultimately, of course, Russia, who is not as closely tied to the United States, but remember, quite a few of the new immigrants who've come in during the late Gilded Age and early 20th century have been from Southern Eastern European countries like Russia. So there are quite a few Russian immigrants in the United States by this time. So we have a lot of ties to the Allies, ethnic ties, cultural, political ties, and we're going to trade heavily with the Allies upon the outbreak of war to a great extent, because it is not only our existing trade ties that cause this, but the basic geography of trade that makes this much more possible. So we have all of these existing and developing ties that lead us as a country to side with the Allies and not, of course, with the Central powers, who we view as provoking and starting this war. To make matters even more one-sided in terms of our public opinion for the Allies, it is the U-boat attacks by Germany that will ultimately be the key factor leading the United States into the war. This is a war that is one of the first modern wars in world history, and lots of new weapons of war will be used, including U-boats, or submarines as they were then called, tanks, airplanes, poison gases, and other chemical weapons of war will also be horrifically used. And so it's no surprise that this new technology is shocking to many. Certainly to Americans when they find American ships and American lives lost due to new technologies like the U-boats. The most famous example of this is the sinking of the British luxury liner, the Lusitania. And you see the luxury liner here on the screen in the bottom photograph. It is a civilian passenger ship, not a military ship. A German U-boat will sink this ship with 128 American civilians on board in 1915, just as the ship is just a few miles off the British coast on a return trip to Great Britain. Now, what is not known then, but what we know now, is that this ship is heavily loaded with ammunition, secretly, covertly being shipped to the British with the approval of President Woodrow Wilson. The Germans will claim that this is so, but this will be denied by the American administration and only discovered many decades later. A German U-boat cannot be held to the traditional rules of war at sea. It cannot provide for the lives of the passengers and the crew upon attack because a U-boat is so small and fragile that it must attack with stealth, using torpedoes, and of course this causes the loss of life of many, as the Lusitania attack did, including all these Americans on board. So this is shocking, this is outrageous. There is war talk in 1915, but Americans are not prepared for war. Wilson certainly does not want to go to war, so he extracts what is in essence an apology from Germany, a promise not to do this again, and reparations or a monetary payment from Germany for this attack. Now here's a look at the map that you have in your text, and also some exercises for the test to do. And you can see the basic two sides here. You see, of course, the Allies in blue. See Great Britain here at the top, France, Italy is going to switch sides during the war, but you see here Italy, and of course Russia here as an allied power. And then you see the central power, so-called, because they're in the center of Europe. You can see Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, or Turkey. So these are the major powers in Europe involved in the war. Now if you look at the geography here, you can see also why we are going to be trading much more heavily with the Allies than with the Central Powers. It's just much easier to get across the Atlantic Ocean to get to the coast of France or to Great Britain and trade with the Allied powers. To get to the Central Powers, that's much more complicated. However, those German U-boats are going to try to prevent a lot of this trade by blockading, patrolling the North Atlantic. And so all this zone is going to be blockaded or patrolled by German ships, including U-boats. And so it's right here that the Lusitania is attacked off the coast of Great Britain in 1915. So again, looking at the map will help explain a lot of what is happening here leading up to the American entry into the war. Let's move on and look at more U-boat attacks that are going to lead directly to the U.S. entrance into the war. In 1917, after years of war have been, of course, very costly in terms of money and human life in Europe, after there's been a stalemate in the trenches in Western Europe, Germany will return once again to unrestricted submarine warfare. What that means is she's going to shoot on sight any ship that gets in that blockade zone that we just looked at. So in January of 1917, this will happen. And this will mean, of course, attacks on more American ships. And here in the photograph, you can see what a German U-boat of this era looks like compared to a Navy ship, a dreadnought, a battleship of this era. So you can see how fragile a dreadnought, how fragile a U-boat would be compared to a dreadnought. 4 more merchant ships are attacked in 1917, and this will lead us directly into a declaration of war that April, in combination with the revelation that Germany has plotted with Mexico in the Zimmermann Note to go to war against us in case we declared war on Germany. So the suggestion that Mexico should invade